I now call to order the Society's 2,438th meeting in the 150th year since its founding on March 13, 1871. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to PSW Science's Spring 2021 meeting and lecture series. Because of COVID-19, the Society is bringing this meeting to you via Zoom from locations all around the globe, rather than our usual home, the John Wesley Powell Auditorium of the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C. This evening will be about alien machine-implemented intelligences. Our speaker is James Evans, professor of sociology and director of the Knowledge Lab at the University of Chicago. I'm Larry Milstein, president and program director of PSW Science, one of the oldest scientific societies of Washington, D.C., founded in 1871 as the Philosophical Society of Washington, to provide a forum to exchange scientific ideas, further scientific understanding, and encourage scientific inquiry. This lecture is being recorded and will be posted to the PSW Science YouTube channel, where it will join over 150 other recordings of PSW Science lectures. We invite you to explore these presentations and to become a member through the PSW website, www.pswscience.org. The Society is grateful for the sponsorships of the 2020-2021 lecture series by the Policy Studies Organization in cooperation with the American Public University and by a donor who has asked to remain anonymous. A hearty thanks to all of our sponsors. Before we turn to the lecture, in keeping with the Society's traditions, we will welcome new members and then read the minutes of the previous meeting and the summary of the previous meeting's lecture. I am pleased to announce that the following new member has been elected to the Society: James Evans, our speaker tonight, who learned of PSW through our invitation to him to speak, and some of his interests will be clear from tonight's lecture. We welcome James to membership. Membership is the most important pillar of the Society. I encourage everyone with an interest in science to become a member. It's easy to do using the PSW Science website, especially in this time of COVID. We encourage you to join the Society and support its activities. PSW is a 501c3 charitable education and professional organization. Dues payments and other donations to PSW Science are tax deductible. Recording Secretary James Heelan will now read the minutes of the 2,437th meeting and the lecture by Kate Kraft on the Europa Clipper mission to Jupiter's icy moon, Europa. James, screen is yours.
Thank you, Larry. Good evening, everyone. On March 19th, 2021, by Zoom video conference broadcast on the PSW Science YouTube channel, President Larry Milstein called the 2,437th meeting of the Society to order at 8:02 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. President Milstein announced that March 13th, 2021 marked 150 years since the Society was formally founded at the Smithsonian Castle in Washington, D.C. On the anniversary day, members of the General Committee gathered at the castle to commemorate the Society's achievement. President Milstein then toasted to the Society with the online audience. He then welcomed new members, and the recording secretary read the minutes of the previous meeting. President Milstein then introduced the speaker for the evening, Kate Kraft, staff scientist in the Space Exploration Group at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory. Her lecture was titled, "The Clipper Mission to Europa, Exploring a Potentially Habitable Ocean World." Roughly the size of Earth's moon, Europa is the smallest of the 4 Galilean satellites of Jupiter. Europa is an ice-covered moon that flexes while orbiting Jupiter. This flexing induces heating throughout the moon in a process scientists call tidal heating. Europa has an induced magnetic field, indicating there is a salty liquid ocean beneath its surface. It is possible that tidal heating could be inducing hydrothermal activity at the sea floor, enabling the ocean to stay liquid. Based on Earth analogs, hydrothermal activity on Europa could also support life. Kraft then showed images of Europa's surface and described its various regions, including ridges, bands, subsumption zones, and impact structures. There is currently some evidence for plumes ejecting through Europa's surface ice. But, Kraft said, while some observations have been intriguing, they have not been repeatable or observed again. NASA's Europa Clipper mission will explore Europa to investigate its habitability by investigating its ice shell, ocean composition, and geology. Its geology objective includes reconnaissance for a potential future lander. Kraft then described in detail Europa Clipper's 10 science investigations. 5 investigations will be remote sensing. Europa Ultraviolet Spectrograph will investigate the existence of plumes. Europa Imaging System, led by PSW member Zibby Turtle of the Applied Physics Laboratory, will use a narrow-angle camera and a wide-angle camera to examine Europa's surface features. Europa Thermal Imaging System will investigate thermal anomalies and regolith characteristics. Mapping Imaging Spectrometer for Europa, or MISE, will assess the habitability of Europa's ocean, the geologic history of the surface, and the search for current geological activity. Radar for Europa Assessment and Sounding, Ocean to Near Surface, or REASON, will examine the ice shell and subsurface water, investigate material exchange, study the tides, and investigate potential future landing sites. 5 investigations will be in situ. Europa Clipper Magnetometer will investigate the ocean by magnetic field induction at multiple frequencies, identify sources of atmosphere, and understand the coupling of Europa to Jupiter's ionosphere and coupling of plumes to flowing plasma. Plasma Instrument for Magnetic Sounding, or PIMS, will determine Europa's magnetic induction response to estimate ocean salinity and thickness, understand weathering and material release into the atmosphere, and Europa's influence in its local environment. Gravity and radio science investigation will use a suite of antennae sending signals to Earth to monitor its trajectory changes and determine Europa's gravitational tides and the existence of the subsurface ocean. Mass Spectrometer for Planetary Exploration, or MASS SPECS, will determine the distribution of major volatiles and key organic compounds in Europa's exosphere and their association with geological features and their abundance in the ocean. Lastly, Surface Dust Analyzer, or SUDA, will map the surface composition of Europa and characterize the alteration of that surface by exogenous dust. Kraft then described the current status of Europa Clipper's instrument hardware. The spacecraft will be powered by 2 sets of 5 solar arrays. The 9 instrument suites will be mounted so that like instruments face the same direction to maximize the number of investigations that can collect data on any given flyby. The most recent trajectory assessment is for Europa Clipper to launch in October 2024 and use a Mars-Earth Gravity Assist, or MEGA, to arrive at Europa in April 2030. The mission is for at least 40 flybys in an approximately 3.5-year prime tour over Europa's Jovian and anti-Jovian hemispheres, covering approximately 80% of the moon's surface. Data will be returned to Earth based on priority order: decisional, encounter, mission, and opportunistic. Kraft concluded by briefly summarizing her work on Europa Lander mission concept and a Europa Tunnelbot mission concept. She then answered questions from the online viewing audience. After the question and answer period, President Milstein thanked the speaker, made the usual housekeeping announcements, and invited guests to join the society. President Milstein adjourned the meeting at 10:02 p.m. The temperature in Washington, D.C., 7 degrees Celsius. Weather, windy. Number of concurrent viewers of the Zoom and YouTube live streams, 141, and views on the PSW Science YouTube and Vimeo channels, 639. Respectfully submitted, James Heelan, Recording Secretary.
Thank you, James. Excellent. As usual, the minutes will be posted to the website in due course. And please send any corrections or comments on the minutes to corresponding secretary, Robin Taylor, at correspondingsec@pswscience.org. A video of the lecture is available for everyone without charge on the PSW Science YouTube channel, the PSW Science Vimeo channel, and it can be accessed directly from the PSW Science website. We now turn to tonight's lecture. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, James Evans. James is professor of sociology and the director of the Knowledge Lab at the University of Chicago. And he also has an appointment at the Santa Fe Institute. James uses large-scale data, machine learning, and generative models to understand how collectives think and what they know. His research involves inquiry into the emergence of ideas, shared patterns of reasoning, and processes of attention, communication, agreement, and certainty. He is interested in thinking and knowing collectives, such as scientific groups and Wikipedia, that involve complex networks of diverse human and machine intelligences collaborating and competing to achieve overlapping aims. His work connects the interaction of these collectives and the agents within them with the knowledge they produce and its value, both internally to them and externally. James is an author on numerous peer-reviewed publications, and he speaks frequently to technical groups and the general public. James earned a BA in anthropology at Brigham Young University and an MA and PhD in sociology at Stanford University. All questions will be fielded in a Q&A session following the lecture. James, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Larry, for this invitation and for your community for allowing me to speak tonight and for inducting me as a new member. Let me share my screen with you. I'm delighted to speak tonight about some of my recent research into the potential and possibility of designing alien artificial intelligences. Artificial intelligences are agents which are defined not by their similarity to humanoid and human intelligence, especially in the context of science and technology, but also in other settings, but by their complementarity to that human intelligence, their ability to create pathways, knowledge, answers that complements and enhances human capacity. And so I'll be focusing on this idea of programming beyond the limits of human collective knowledge and reason. Just a little bit about myself as background. So I run a center called Knowledge Lab, which is focused on using large-scale data, machine learning, and intelligent crowdsourcing or adaptive crowdsourcing to understand and represent knowledge at large scales across collectives. And this could be scientific knowledge or technical knowledge. It could also be political or ideological or cultural knowledge of various types. We're very interested in understanding some of the polarization that we see in American society and, of course, around the world. We're also interested in understanding that at a deep level, so understanding the collective heuristics by which certainties are achieved and doubts insinuated in these systems of knowledge. And then third, transforming those knowledge-bearing systems and including those, the scientific and scholarly process through a kind of a computationally enhanced knowledge about knowledge. And so we spend a lot of time measuring knowledge at large scales, identifying knowing states and knowing signals between persons and organizations, between machines and sensors and algorithmic analyzers. And we've also spent a lot of time cultivating what I'll call a science of science over the course of the past 5 or so years. These are a few pieces that myself and other authors in my group have published in Science or Nature about meta-knowledge, about the science of science, about the crowding of the scientific frontier. So we're really interested in that emerging subfield of taking the full imaginary of the scientific process, which comes from all of the sciences, including the social sciences, to understand and better accomplish the processes and stoke the engines of innovation, which are science and technology in society. Today, my focus is going to begin with this question of what kind of AI do we want? What kind of artificial intelligence do we want as scientists and as a society? And how can we design the kind that we want? Do we want an artificial humanoid intelligence? Is that the kind of intelligence that we want to engineer primarily for our society as a target? So this idea of humanoid artificial intelligence and humanoid capacity comes, of course, over the 19th and the 20th century, certainly Mary Shelley's work, the Frankenstein, the imaginary, the possibility of creating artificial life has been around for some time. In the 20th century, however, we see things like Karel Čapek's humanoid universal robots, and Fritz Lang's Metropolis Maria. And these are humanoid thinking, intelligent, interacting beings. A little later, almost half a century, 20 years later, 30 years later, we see in 1950 in Alan Turing's Computing Machinery and Intelligence, this idea of the imitation game and the new standard of intelligence, which is the human standard, right? So the way in which we distinguish something as intelligent or unintelligent is to identify the degree to which we can distinguish that intelligence from human intelligence. And so every time online you're focused or forced to do a CAPTCHA or something that distinguishes you from an algorithm, you're engaging in one of these many Turing tests, right? Which is assessing your intelligence, assessing your capacity, assessing the fact that you're a human. This possibility was furthered by Arthur Samuel's work in the 1950s on a checkers playing robot. And this checkers playing robot not only rastered the endpoint to human intelligence, right, to a mimicry of human intelligence, but he tried to achieve superior or at least equitable performance to sophisticated human players of checkers by defining an algorithm that learned from human moves. So rather than just human outcomes, it trained itself on human moves, and he defined this idea of a self-learning algorithm as a result of its rastering to human training data, expert training data, machine learning. And this really became the canonical or the first clear example of a supervised machine learning algorithm. About the same time, 1955, John McCarthy at Dartmouth College applied to the Rockefeller Foundation for a 10-week summer conference or workshop that would take place at Dartmouth, and he asked for 10, eventually got parts of 20 experts to reflect on the possibility of artificial intelligence. And that conference was held the following summer in 1956 and gathered together Claude Shannon and Marvin Minsky, Herb Simon, many others who became real legends in the context of the artificial intelligence movement, to focus specifically on humanoid creativity, on human intelligence and problem solving. And if you are to ask Google, which is to say, if you were to ask the collective brain of associations, which are represented in image captions, what is artificial intelligence, or just artificial intelligence, this is the image search, right? It's rastered to a human brain, these circuits that are formed to a human brain. So our association is in line with the specific objective functions of machine learning algorithms, which are attempting to create artificial intelligences which are rastered to human capacity. Similarly, if you type in robots, the collective imagination turns you to a field of robots which are humanoid, which have dual eye sockets, which have, they're bipedal, they've got two hands. Now, there are certainly other approaches like the reinforcement learning approach, which sometimes achieves performance independent of the pathway of supervised learning. And we'll talk a little bit about in the future. But even that is ignorant rather than sensitive to human performance. So when it produces performances which are different from human performances in terms of the distribution of potential and specific actions in the context of a performance or specific decisions in the context of a decision maker, it may or may not, it's ignorant of whether or not it's familiar to the human intelligence. Similarly, human-inspired deliberations have gone into the very idea underlying machine learning algorithms. So Oliver Selfridge, who was one of the participants in the McCarthy conference, the Dartmouth conference, was thinking about human voting systems. For example, when he considered the possibility of random forests, which were arguably the first successful agglomerative approach to create multiple algorithmic agents that you would ensemble over to create a more intelligent outcome. Similarly, Marvin Minsky, in his book, suggestively called The Society of Mind, was inspired by developmental psychology and also this idea of deliberative systems, not just voting systems where everybody goes into an anonymous booth and the answers are average, but actually deliberative systems. And we see in deep learning neural networks, very recent work from this last summer, for example, which identifies optimal pathways and performances of these deep learning neural networks in the context of machine vision, in the context of identifying different objects in images as a function of the path length between those internal nodes, which are these activations inside of the deep learning neural network, and the clustering coefficient that corresponds to those nodes, which is to say that successful algorithms are naturally creating diversity in the context, in the belly of these deep learning intense algorithms. And of course, this is a very small deep learning model. Modern models, for example, GPT-3, which has 175 billion parameters, which correspond, for example, to the edges, to the lines inside this neural network. So they're much, much larger, they're much deeper, but they have characteristic structure which suggests, and in some cases is designed to behave like deliberative human networks. So in this context, with 7 billion humans on Earth, is artificial intelligence, artificial humanoid intelligence, which is targeted to human performances, the most efficient investment, strategic investment, and is it the most ethical investment? So we see at the same time stagnation in labor productivity in OECD countries, dropping in the last 20 years from 2.8% to 1.3% productivity. So that rate of productivity increase has slowed over time. And that's going to slow, as Darren Acemoglu and a number of other prominent economists, Eric Bert-Hofson, among others, is going to increase if we target our active development of artificial intelligences to replace and substitute human activity. Now, it turns out that there was and is another alternative vision to artificial intelligence, to AI, I should say, which was coined in exactly the same year of John McCarthy's artificial intelligence, and that's amplifying intelligence or augmented intelligence. So William Ashby, in his Introduction to Cybernetics, also published in precisely the same year, in 1955, writes about the possibility of intelligence amplification, of cognitive augmentation, of machine augmented intelligence. J.C.R. Licklider, within a couple of years, wrote about man-computer symbiosis. Douglas Engelbart, who really designed certain kinds of file systems, hyperlinks. The mouse was pioneered in his initial and powerful presentation of interfaces, augmenting human intellect. So this idea, this fantasy and aspiration was for humans to augment their intelligence through unmediated manipulation of information. So we're going to accelerate human thinking. We're going to try to create devices which minimize the transaction costs between what you're thinking and all of the information of the world that will be relevant to those decisions. If the humanoid robot is an instantiation of artificial intelligence, the interface is the instantiation of augmented intelligence. So mice, screens, file systems, hypertext, EEG helmets, or Neuralink, right? So these are things which are all designed to accelerate human thinking. And of the two AIs, augmented or amplified versus artificial intelligence, there's almost no question that this second AI, this augmented intelligence program, was certainly the more commercially successful and the more human augmenting. It's useful, it's productivity enhancing, it's also necessarily incremental, and it has diminishing marginal returns. It's boring. And so the question that I pose is that all, right? Either AI could be redundant, right? Artificial intelligence that thinks like us, or it could be efficient, but incremental, right? Augmented intelligence allows us to think with some increment of speed or efficiency. And so I'm going to explore the possibility of building AIs that help us think differently than we think, that help us think better than we think, and that help us think bigger than we think collectively, that surprise us, that create a widening possibility rather than a narrowing possibility of questions and answers in our ongoing quest to solve the world's problems. As inspiration, I want to throw up a few other kinds of collectives which have been influential. So consider the Netflix Prize, which was fielded in 2006 and awarded in 2009. So this was Netflix on the cusp of its becoming truly digital. At the beginning of this prize, it had an algorithm that tried to predict and recommend the kinds of movies that you might want to watch. And it was called the Cinematch algorithm. And it felt like it could do better. At that time, it was sending out DVDs by mail. And so it wanted to improve that algorithm by at least 10%. And so it fielded an ongoing crowdsourced competition between anyone in the world who could improve upon their algorithm by more than 10%. And they expected it would take about 6 months. And at 6 months, the teams were at about 7%. And 2 years later, the teams were about at 8%. and people were losing interest. You had teams from all over the world, but none of them were succeeding in really closing the gap to make the marginal inference to receive the prize. Until two of the teams, the first place at the time in the leaderboard rankings, the first place team and the fifth place team. The first place team was from IBM's Watson Research Center. I'm sorry, it was from Bell Labs. And that Bell Labs team had an algorithm that was based on collaborative filtering. So imagine that you have an enormous matrix, and that matrix is persons, right, that are the rows, and movies, which are the columns. And so what that factorization algorithm was performing was identifying persons that were similar to each other and simultaneously identifying movies that are similar to one another. And the fifth place team had a very different approach. This was an Australian team, and they had a really strong internal model of new life events. A life event is when you get a new girlfriend or boyfriend, you have a child. So The Revenant is being watched at the same time that Barney is being watched. And the recognition of the algorithm, these are two separate people. And in separating them into two separate people, it can more effectively match people who are like other people, and movies and TV shows which are like other movies and shows. And so those two algorithms and those two teams merged, and all of a sudden they bumped their algorithm up to 9, and then other teams and algorithms merged, and then they merged. And in the end, you had this enormous collapse of all of the top 30 teams collapsing into 2 teams, which both produced an answer that was above 10% within 40 minutes of one another. So what you have is of these 200 data science competitions, or of the many more than 200 teams that were competing for this $1 million prize, it was in the end an ensemble of very different intelligences, both different human intelligences and different algorithmic intelligences or approaches. Another example of diversity in crowdsourcing is something called Kaggle. So this is a website that allows data scientists from around the world to participate and compete in posted problems. And you get data science competitions which involve searching for the Higgs boson at CERN, identifying gestures from the Microsoft Kinect device, HIV research and identification, finding a better and more sensitive chest rating, traffic forecasting, etc. What's interesting in the now more than 300 Kaggle competitions which have been fielded over the last several years, and Kaggle was purchased in 2017 by Google, is that ensemble models, which is to say different kinds of models, always win. They've always won. There's never been one of those competitions which was solved by a singular model. They were all solved by a diverse menagerie of models, which were ensembled and brought together in the context of this ultimate machine. This idea of crowdsourcing diversity is highlighted also by the history of chess. In the 1980s, humans beat machines. From 1994 to 2004, it was indeterminate. In the 2000s, machines systematically beat humans. But in a 2005 play chess competition that hosted a free chess or a centaur chess competition, which could include any combination of humans and machines on a team, the lineup of winners was very interesting. So the first place winner in this competition was Zach S., which included 2 humans, Stephen Crampton and Zachary Stevens, who were adequate chess players, not excellent chess players, and 3 separate machines, which were desktop computers at the time, and 4 separate software that were running across those 3 machines. They beat out 2 grandmasters, Grandmaster Vladimir Kosarev and Konstantin Landa, who had powerful single engine machines, and they blew out of the water Hydra, which is a multi-machine chess specific supercomputer. The idea is that those individuals compose the best or comprise the best collective intelligence. And so I'd like to think about that and explore the possibility of designing collective intelligences and designing alien intelligences which are complementary to human insight. I'm going to step back and think, however, for a moment about the potential and power of collective diversity in the context of sciences to allow us some objectives that we can use to train these algorithms, these alien algorithms, and then we'll explore a case that suggests what they can do. So how does science as a collective think? Does science collectively think deductively, like Aristotle proposed, like logically extend new hypotheses from facts or axioms which are known before or assumed before? Alternatively, does science collectively think inductively, like imaginatively generalizing from observations like Francis Bacon proposed, in his Novum Organum, and became really the constitution of the first broad scientific society, along with Académie des Sciences in Paris, the Philosophical Society of London, or does it think abductively? And Charles Sanders Peirce, at the end of the 19th century, proposed that almost every recent advance, and certainly almost every advance that we see today in technology, science, or business, has come from the creative production of hypotheses based on surprising or theory-defying evidence. This is deduction that's had a head-on collision with induction, right? You have expectations, and then facts disrupt those expectations. They prove that you're wrong, and that drives the development of new theoretical possibilities. I explored this recently in the context of tens of millions of publications in biomedical science, in the physical sciences, and in technology. And I did this through a machine learning approach of creating a manifold. And that manifold was tuned so that it would produce papers. If you did a draw from that manifold, it would produce papers or combinations of elements, which are represented in this figure, that are the most likely to be published in that year. And then that manifold would move with Brownian motion, and you pulled down a new draw of a hypergraph. Each hyperedge in that graph is a paper that contains the elements of that paper. And it turns out that you're able to perform very successfully. We're able to predict and distinguish papers that show up versus papers that didn't show up at about 98%. So we're able to completely distinguish the most realistic papers and precisely the papers that are most likely to show up in the next given period. And in that space, the inverse of the most likely papers, which is to say the most surprising papers, or the surprisingness of those papers, ends up being a character of novelty. And that novelty, it turns out, so for example, this green paper here, this plant thioredoxin H, an animal-like thioredoxin occurring in multiple cell compartments, was a radical paper. It took elements which ended up being in animals before, identifying them in the context of plants, identifying new functions that we didn't think of as being possible in plants by analogy to their orthologs in animal contexts. I mean, it was a radical paper. Other papers, which are equally important, are much more expected in the sense that they draw together elements which are frequently drawn together in the context of other research. And when you look at that unpredictability of the papers, that unpredictability itself predicts the majority of the likelihood of a paper receiving a major award like a Nobel Prize or being in the top 10% of citations. So we can predict as a function of a paper's unpredictability according to this most predictive model, right? About 60% of the likelihood of being in the top 10% of citations. Again, this is before something has received any acclaim. This is completely ex ante measurement. And so we see this in the context of PubMed. We also see it in the context of physics papers inscribed in the American Physical Society journals. We also see it in the context of patents. And one of the things that's striking is that science is different from technology in this context. Science builds on the shoulders of our audience. Technology, on the other hand, knows less about more. So science spends more time intensively citing the things and the sources which are most familiar to its audiences and its journals, and spends much less time talking about and justifying the things which are unusual. So they're basically science as an activity, as a social activity, is an activity of justifying your scientific choices to a community. And but the thing that's the most striking and the thing that's most relevant for a design of alien intelligences is this idea that who produces these novel or surprising discoveries? Is it unusual people who have surprising careers? For example, they trace, they went through physics and then biology and then the social sciences or economics. And as a result of those unusual combinations within themselves, that produces the greatest surprise? It turns out no. Is it unusual teams? Jason and the Argonauts, that bring together people from across the far-flung domains of science. Also somewhat, but not the most. The thing that's by far the most predictive, and it accounts for about 70% of these most surprising discoveries, are expeditions of people with backgrounds in one part of science who traverse over to another part of science as a group and solve their problem with their alien patterns. This radical insight of the unusual papers comes in conversation between problems within a community and aliens outside that community. Sometimes we've talked about this as a conversation between insiders, priests, if you will, who are can identify familiar puzzles, are aware of anomalies. They understand the scripture of prior assumptions within their field in conversation with outsiders or prophets who solve those problems with alien patterns. If a problem was surprising, then the aliens basically bring a surprising pattern to make the surprising unsurprising. And so this contrast of expertises ends up being the place in which advance takes place. This motivates the idea, can we build alien intelligences which increase the discovery potential of science, right? And can they increase that discovery potential by bringing patterns which are invisible to those who sit inside the established communities and fields of science? One other justification, which comes out of my work on the replication crisis. So since 2005, scientists have been broadly increased in their concern over the likelihood that findings replicate. And this came out of a series of both simulation papers and experimental work that suggested that, that the scientific literature was harder to replicate and less likely to generalize than had been previously acknowledged. And this concern, some would call it a crisis, some would call it a wise acknowledgement, has become the most prominent in the context of pharmacology, genetics, and psychology. But it's creeping into many other areas and has been explored in many other of those areas. One of the things that my group did to understand what led to science which was more robust, which was more likely to replicate in the future, and less robust, less likely to replicate, was a high throughput strategy for conceptual replication and reproducibility, where we lined up data from tens of thousands of publications with high throughput experiments. High throughput experiments are experimental results which are produced by robot many times. So they're replicated on average about 200 times per experiment across, in our case, different dosage levels of drugs, different cell lines, different durations, et cetera. So initially we looked at this in the context of drug-gene interactions. As I mentioned, we lined up these published claims in the literature with these high throughput experimental claims, and then we identified properties of the scientific community that was producing those facts which did or did not replicate in these massively replicated robotic experiments. When I say robotic, I mean robots were performing the experiments, but they were actual wet lab experiments that were performed on actual human tissue culture cells. And what we find is something that's good. So there is collective correction in science, which is to say, when you find cases where there are more researchers who are analyzing something, it's more likely to be replicated and show up. And similarly, where you have high variability in the biology of the experiment, it's more likely in the literature to seek contention about the relative effect sizes of those perturbagens, those drugs on those genes. But we also identified the centralization of the scientific communities that were producing work on particular interaction across papers. Some claims, right, some scientific facts were produced by many different groups that didn't collaborate with one another, that didn't produce each other as students. And in other cases, we saw something very different, where you get the same PI, the same private investigator, the same scientist who's on many, many different papers of this, enormous overlap between the research groups. They're not performing many independent experiments. They're effectively performing one experiment over and over again. And we measured this also directly by looking at the social independence, the overlap, the Jacquard index between the sets of authors across all these papers, the methodological independence, the degree to which different methods are being used to identify this effect, and different prior knowledge or expectation as a function of the things that you cite in that paper or reference as being influential for that paper. And what we find is that if you're from the same group, then you're much more likely to agree with yourself. You're much less likely to produce a disagreement with yourself, and that there are social dependencies correlate with limited methodological variation. If you are overlapping in authors, you are going to use the same methods. But the most striking effect or finding is that findings from decentralized communities that use different methods and cite different sources of information are much more likely to replicate. And findings from concentrated overlapping communities, which are not diverse in their background knowledge and not diverse in their methods, are much less likely to replicate outside of the context of their precise experiment. We find the same thing when we analyze clinical trials data. For example, using the Cochrane Reviews library, we analyze the likelihood of a fact replicating as a function of the likelihood that the authors on different clinical trials about the same pharmaceutical, for example, or the same therapeutic that could be non-pharmaceutical, were in the outcome. And what we see is massive underdispersion, which is to say, even if two groups, we're testing the same therapeutic, that they find much less disagreement than would be expected at random by those groups, even if they were both correct. And we see a similar thing at a macro scale. So as you have fields that grow, when they grow, they crystallize, which is to say that the things that end up being cited across many of those papers and projects within that field are increasingly the same things. And that you see that the flocking that is associated with modern science, where people follow each other, is associated with a dramatic slowing of future understanding. Most recently, we have a paper that's forthcoming that looks at this in the context of gene-gene interactions. And by taking this into account, you can do much better at predicting those effects, in this case, gene-gene interactions, by taking into account the relative diversity that's involved in those communities, which allows you to basically build science on a firmer foundation. And we can identify the effect and importance of this for policies across these contexts. So for example, if you have more communities, this is across different databases, the number of claimed communities, so the increase in the claimed communities dramatically increases our ability to forecast the robustness of a particular finding in a particular context. And similarly, we see this idea that if you have a much broader spread of communities and underlying methods, again, you're much more likely to be able to predict that future and create something which is identifiable and robust. And these are these prediction algorithms. These are what's called area under the curve. The flat diagonal straight line is a random prediction. So just as a function of understanding the diversity of the community dramatically improves our ability to predict the robustness of that outcome. And the bottom line is the more diverse, the more we're able to predict, and the more likelihood, the greater likelihood that those findings will be replicated and robust in new contexts. So connected communities are associated with weakened results, and robust facts are established across clusters. Novel discoveries occur across fields. So we've got both of these two facts about science going together, that diversity is critical for the robustness of scientific facts that are produced. It's also critical for the generation of new ideas. right? That diversity of conversation facilitates that exploration, which leads to abduction, where a surprising failure can lead to a new theoretical advance or an empirical predictive advance as a function of patterns or ideas that come from outside that field. So this led us to do a couple of things. One, I'm in the process of building communities that are focused on new vision of AI as diverse or alien or alternative intelligences. This requires us to know more about humans and human communities and not less, right? So this broader program requires us to create effectively digital doubles of human minds and bodies, of collectives, and also digital doubles of the worlds in which we live, right? The material world, the scientific world, the technological world, the cultural world, and identify this optimal difference and diversity so that we can generate diverse or alien intelligence coaches, which can guide us to think about things in new ways, diverse alien intelligence collaborators that can provoke us to think in new ways or to check our supposed intelligence, burst the bubbles of certainty that come as a result of speaking the same language of people who were otherwise connected, and also diverse alien intelligence coordinators that can assemble teams in ways that facilitate their collaborative productivity. And in particular here, I'm going to pose this question of, can we design human artificial intelligence diversity that increases collective imagination in ways that's productive? One way in which we sought to analyze this was through replication of a study that was published in July of 2019 in Nature. This was a very interesting study. It's called Unsupervised Word Embeddings Capture Latent Knowledge from Material Science Literature. Kind of a boring title, as all these titles are, but underneath it was a spark of deep interest and genius. What scholars associated with Lawrence Livermore Labs and the University of California at Berkeley did was they took the literature, so millions of publications which were associated with soft and hard matter research in the context of materials design, and they were focused on electromagnetic properties. So properties of thermoelectricity, ferroelectricity, and photovoltaic capacity. So they were interested in materials that would have these properties. And what they did was they used an unsupervised machine learning algorithm. An unsupervised machine learning algorithm means that you're not telling it exactly what to predict. You're creating, in this particular case, identifying structure from large-scale data that is self-supervising. You're not expert supervising it, you're allowing that data to supervise itself, and then you're using that unsupervised, that intelligence that has basically trained itself from the data to make predictions about something that you don't know. In this case, to make predictions about materials, chemicals that would have or would be discovered to have these properties in future years. And they found that they were able to do a few things with these unsupervised spaces. On the one hand, these unsupervised spaces possessed the compositionality of the underlying properties. So, for example, in the left figure B here, you see that the oxide of the adding of the of the process of oxidation ends up being one hidden dimension in this hundreds of dimensional space. Another is the structure of ends up being another, so there are many, these are high dimensional spaces, in this case, a 300 dimensional space, and the compositional properties of these various chemicals, many of them were reproduced in the context of the space. And other papers recently, prior to this paper, had shown that you could recover, for example, just from the language of a database of molecules, the periodic table. So you could capture molecular and atomic masses and their shells just from databases of frequently occurring chemicals. But what they did, and then I think that the second and more powerful thing was they used those predictions. So the materials that were close to those properties in this embedding space, they used as predictions. If they weren't already identified as having those material properties, they predicted that they would have them in future years. And they found that that simple unsupervised prediction had a 40% precision, which was deemed to be very high in the context of there are many possible materials. And that was over the ensuing 20 years. And so we thought, well, one way in which we might be able to do better, on the one hand, at this task, is to incorporate an awareness of human experts in this process. And so if we included human experts, we could accelerate this process, we hypothesized. But we could also do something else. We could do something that doesn't just predict the things that would come to pass in the future, but the things that wouldn't have come to pass but should have, right? Scientifically valid connections, scientifically meaningful discoveries, materials that have these thermoelectric properties that scientists wouldn't think to ask as a result of the situatedness of scientists. So scientists are non-randomly distributed over the space of questions and answers in science. Why? Because we have disciplines, because we have institutionalized education. There are chemistry departments and physics departments that admit students that have to take certain classes. You take a sequence of math that's a different sequence than it could have been, but it's the sequence that was institutionalized as a result of a deep history of commitment to certain kinds of formalisms. So this creates boundaries. It creates dense clusters of experts, and it also creates empty spaces where nobody resides. There are no people that sit inside those spaces that are available to make transitive cognitive inferences. So if there are people, for example, authors, A, who sit between properties and entities or materials, then they're available to make these cognitive, the potential that this entity or this material has this property is cognitively available to them, right? They can make that transitive inference because they're educated in both of them. They are aware of both of them. On the other hand, where you have two separate author communities, A1 and A2, and only A2 has access to this material and its properties, and only A1 has access to this desirable property that they're interested in, it's much less likely that somebody is going to make that inference. They're going to imagine it, they're going to investigate it, and they're going to discover it, because no one was educated. No one is aware of those things. The scientific community hasn't allocated people to that part of the space. So what we did to explore this hypothesis and to explicitly generate alien intelligences, in this case, these are alien intelligences that couldn't have been produced by our intellectual and innovative system. They couldn't have been produced by our higher education system. And to identify the inferences that are most likely cognitively to scientists in this space, we built what's called a hypergraph. I mentioned this approach earlier. So each paper is now a hyperedge, and that hyperedge contains a couple of different things. It includes properties like thermoelectricity, but also something like the ability to treat or vaccinate against COVID-19, the ability to treat or be a therapeutic effectively against any number of diseases, and also the authors who investigate those things, right? So all those things, both the things that could be available to the scientists who are thinking about them and the scientists themselves, we put inside that hypergraph. So in my little figure here, the shapes that are empty are the authors, and the shapes that are filled, that are red, are the properties. The shapes that are filled, that are blue, are the materials. And so we asked this question: what inferences are most cognitively likely? And we produced a random walk over this hypergraph of science, right? And so what does that mean? It just means we literally programmed a walk to start at a property, thermoelectricity. We randomly identify a paper that talks about thermoelectricity. We randomly identify an author or a material inside that paper. We randomly jump to another paper with that author or material. We identify an author or material in that paper. We randomly jump to another paper that has that author material, millions of times. And if you think about it for a minute, you'll see that if there are no people between a property and a material in the scientific space, then there will be there will be very few pathways that move through that space, because there are no people, there are no scientists to whom the materials or property and materials are cognitively available, who could imagine, investigate, and successfully complete and publish a study which demonstrates that association. And so what we did, and you can see this in the context of coronavirus, for example, USC in fall of 2020 inaugurated an analysis, and that analysis is using progesterone to treat coronavirus, COVID-19 infections in men. So you can see basically a set of random walks here. These are actual walks where through coronavirus, it jumps to an author who studies that coronavirus. That author also studies progesterone, or that author also studies letrozole, which is explored in the context of progesterone, or fluorouracil, which is so basically we were able to identify just through our random walks the vast majority, 75% of the papers that are actually referenced inside the clinical trial motivation, and more than 60% of the authors on any of those papers, we were able to walk to as a result of these random walks across the space. And so what we did was we also built a comparable embedding method, right, that built a manifold over these random walks in a way that was precisely formally identical to the way in which the Nature publication by scientists at Lawrence Livermore Labs analyzed just content. We added these authors by embedding, instead of sentences from these papers, we embedded these random walks through people, right? Millions of these random walks through people in a formally identical way. And immediately out of the box doubled our prediction rate. And the reason we doubled that prediction rate is not magic. The reason we doubled that prediction rate is because we recognized that what the scientists in the Nature article were predicting was not actually just materials that might have this property, but materials that would be imagined to have that property, investigated to have that property, found to have that property, and published to have that property. And so we find in the context of thermal electricity a jump from 40 to well over 80% prediction likelihood. So everything we predict almost becomes successful. Ferroelectricity, a jump to well over 80%, and photovoltaics, well over 90%, which is to say that virtually everything that we predict will have a photovoltaic property over the next 20 years, will be discovered as having that property over the next 20 years. We extended this analysis to the context of drugs. We identified, I actually, forgive me, I flipped this around. It's 100 diseases and 450 drugs from a candidate set of like 4,000 drugs. What we were trying to do is identify drugs that are FDA approved that could be repurposed to treat a particular condition. And so we, again, build a system that's very much like these material properties, not very much like, identical to the formal properties of that of those properties, and then we're able to achieve a 50% improvement right out of the box just by including the authors in the system through this process of building an AI that's aware of the distribution of experts in that space. And in this particular case, we're trying to compete with that set of experts, right? We're trying to nudge the machine to make the inferences that the scientists will in the future make in that system. And we do the same thing with porting this to vaccine contexts. In this context, in the search for COVID-19 vaccines, we identify not 100%, but a 300% improvement. And what's interesting is there were works of network science that were used to make predictions about which drugs would have COVID-19 alleviating properties or be effective COVID-19 vaccination agents. And that used a whole series of very deep neural networks to use protein-protein interaction as a basis for these predictions. In their case, they're predicting not its efficacy, but the likelihood that it's going to receive enough support to start a clinical trial. And we beat that algorithm. So that algorithm that takes multiple layers and multiple separate encodings of the protein-protein interaction network system, which is completely blind. Our algorithm is completely blind to. And we still beat that algorithm just by taking into account the distributions of experts, by copying people even more, by making the algorithm cognitively plausible in this case. And we can see how this allows us to trace discoveries in science in the context of coronavirus. We can literally walk through the pathway, which was acknowledged and described by the authors themselves in a series of interviews on National Public Radio. Our algorithm automatically discovered the inferences about how they came to that possibility and who it came to. Again, why is that happening? These are heat maps which capture the distribution of authors. So higher green means you've got more authors that are sitting atop that peak, and sparse places are places where there are no authors that are sitting between those elements in the system. The text prediction, which is ignorant to authors, which was the basis of that last Nature paper, which we were replicating and expanding on, are the red nodes, and they are kind of ignorant to that landscape. Ours are not ignorant. Ours, the blue predictions, are sitting right on top of that landscape, and that is the reason they're successful. And what suggests even further why it is that they're successful is that we're able to predict the very scientists that are going to make those discoveries as a function of identifying the people who happen to have published things on these disjoint sets of information, who will have available to them these cognitive inferences, and facilitates the process and the possibility of predicting and really betting on discovering or assembling, directly discovering teams to catalyze implausible discoveries. However, I think these findings also do something to trivialize these predictions, because again, we're not just predicting like new materials, we're predicting the people who are going to make the inferences in this space. It suggests that these algorithms haven't really understand the underlying process. And one highlight of that is our algorithm that is aware of the human community does really well right after the time we make the predictions, because that's where the people are. And algorithms that are blind to that distribution of humans do better later on. So 10 years after prediction, those algorithms do better because the scientific community has readjusted itself over that distribution of opportunities. So we use this to build alien intelligences that can do better than either, better than systems that predict new future human discoveries. Now, of course, we can't do any better in some ways at predicting new future human discoveries, because in some cases, like photovoltaics, everything we predict is correct. But we can do better if we have first principle simulation understanding of these systems. We can see the degree to which predictions which avoid humans, which humans will not make, or are very unlikely to make in the future literature as a function of just where they distribute cognitively across the space. So we're able to identify the likelihood that alien intelligences that we can structure as a function of their ability to avoid human inferences in this space are able to be likely successful. And so what we find is, for example, we're looking at thermoelectricity. Power factor is a theoretical quantity which is highly predictive of the likelihood that a material will have thermoelectric property. It's not dispositive, it doesn't completely determine it, but it is highly likely. And what we see is this is the space of candidate predictions, which have reasonably high power factors. Right at the center is things for which there's an author that sits right between the property and the material. And things that are way out there at the infinite ring, at the very edge, are completely disconnected. There are no authors. There is no way. There's no person that is available to make that inference. And at the right, we see the actual predictions that we undertake as a result of tuning this dial from, on the one hand, the most human to the neutral case where it's ignorant of humans to the most alien, right? And as we look through this space of most alien predictions, we're able to see that those that are very far away, extremely unlikely for humans who have been trained in the way that humans historically, scientifically are trained, would be available to make, are still highly likely as a function of this power factor. Similarly, we find the case for COVID-19. So for example, if we identify things that are far, that avoid humans in this space, that basically are cognitively alien and much more surprising to the human scientific system, because no one would produce those, and certainly couldn't produce them as a function of their own individual distribution of training, are also very likely to have high linkage or transitive affinity through a protein-protein interaction with the virus. So to generate robust insight and rapidly advance science and technology, you need an ensemble of diverse intelligences. And this suggests that we can actually take steps to generate more diversity, to design diversity, design aliens that are fit to complement, in this particular case, human scientific awareness, but also universal properties that are different from the universal limitations of human cognition. And we're exploring several of those limitations right now. Obviously, you don't want a completely alien intelligence, which is to say an alien intelligence which is so distant from humanity that you can't communicate with it. Similarly, in the context of biological evolution, there's a well-known phenomenon called hybrid vigor, where two subspecies, right? So two organisms that are really at the boundary of sexual compatibility become the most relevant to each other evolutionarily by having been conditioned and trained in the context of different environments, which lead to different traits. And so they become more relevant to each other the more distant they are, until they can no longer sexually reproduce, at which point they become less relevant to one another. And so what we're trying to do here is identify these optimally different and optimally similar augmented or alien intelligences, which are designed precisely to capture things which are beyond our capacity to imagine, and yet are the most relevant for the objective, for the projects, for the advances that we seek to accomplish. Now, thinking about building AI in this way really turns on its head the traditional way in which we've thought about training artificial intelligence and the problem of artificial intelligence. So one of the key problems that people have talked about in the past is what's called the problem of superintelligence. How do we create machines that really slavishly follow the values of humanity through a control regime? How do we literally, like, tight their restriction bolts? My colleague Alison Gopnik at Berkeley calls this the Stepford Wives theory of machine training, where you're basically slavishly creating these robots that linger on your every word and desire. This is not going to create something that's highly complementary. That's going to require a different kind of a logic, what Professor Gopnik calls a caregiving logic, right? A logic that explores the independent capacity, the alien capacity of these robots, not to perform human functions, but to perform different things, to identify alien but complementary objectives and alien capacities, alien imaginations, which can optimally complement human objectives in this search for scientific advance, prosperity, and really advanced capacity, right? Expanding rather than limiting human capacity. All this leads me to the conclusion that for AI to make a big difference for society, we need a new AI that radically augments, not marginally, not incrementally augments human intelligence by understanding and programming past the limits of human individual and collective reason, and training diverse ensembles of human and machine intelligences, alien intelligences that can work together to achieve and expand the common good. With that, I'd like to acknowledge some of the folks on my team. Jamshid Surati was the lead author on the most recent paper that deals specifically with these alien intelligences, which is under review, and Mara Lewis, Valentin Danchev, Gonghyun Kang, Haizi Yu, Brendan Chambers, Sasha Belikov, and many others are working on related projects and featured in various of the papers that I mentioned tonight. So with that, I look forward to taking your questions.
Well, thank you very much, James. It's a lot to think about in your talk here. I'm sure we have some questions, so we have time for a Q&A now. If you can turn off your, there you go.
I will.
Zoom participants will.
And I will take 1 minute to take a bio break. I'll be right back.
Okay.
You're queuing up the questions.
Zoom great. Just go. You can leave the, there you go. Zoom participants can raise their Zoom hand or type their question in the Zoom Q&A panel. As usual, I will call on Zoom participants in turn to unmute their mic and ask their question. Zoom participants who don't want to speak their question aloud, please write it in the Zoom Q&A panel and note in your text that you would prefer for me to read it. You could just say, do not call on me, read text, or something like that. YouTube viewers, you can ask questions and text using the YouTube chat box. These will be relayed to me and I will read them loud. In fact, all text questions will be read aloud unless the questioner wants to ask the question directly. So we are going to be waiting for our speaker for the Q&A panel. And I guess I can try and fill up the time by telling you about some upcoming talks. The spring schedule has been posted in full on the website. So our next speaker, which I haven't memorized them all. Our next speaker will be the 2439th meeting on 23 April. In 2 weeks, there will be two speakers, S. Bennett and Dan Irwin of the Crossrail project. And they'll be speaking about building the 15 billion pound Elizabeth line subway that has been dug using a digital reconstruction of London Underground beneath London skyscrapers. And I'll tell you about the rest of the spring schedule when we get towards the end of the meeting. So let's start with a question from Frederica de Rema. Frederica?
Yes. James, thank you so much for your very kind of fire hose presentation. So first of all, I wanted to say that what you talked about alien, you used a provocative term in some ways to describe something which we call multidisciplinary, or I call it multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary. And I'm a big believer in that. You know, coming from one field, applying your knowledge into another field. Myself, with the advent of parallel computing in '84, I proposed a computational model which was very different than the fork and join or master slave, the computer scientists. And the long story kind of short is the model, my model, the SPMD model is the predominant model for parallel computing. And then in '87, I started at IBM, TJ Watson, somebody said the first multidisciplinary group to bring people from multiple disciplines to, in a sense, understand how we should design the new parallel computer architectures all the way from the hardware to the kind of software and the architectural of the parallel machines. So I'm a big believer in that. And I think with some of the data that you showed, you kind of formalized this importance of transferring training knowledge from one field to another. And as I've said myself, now the advances are in the confluence of fields. And science progresses and technology in relay ways, something that becomes an idea becomes exploitable or verifiable because other technologies or other science has in a sense progressed. So all that is very nice. And one thing that I kind of, going back to your provocative alien term, I think I kind of agree with the results and where you're going. But the emphasis when you say using alien, that means the human in the loop, right? I mean, you've kind of articulated in a different way to have the human in the loop in terms of, because machine learning can go rogue, there are issues of interpretability. So you do need the human intuition, the physics intuition or the scientific intuition in the discoveries. So how do you see, I mean, certainly a lot of the tools you're developing are very useful as tools of the scientists, but you can never take the scientist out of the loop. So in your kind of advocation of this alien artificial intelligence, is that what you mean, having the human?
Yeah, okay. So lots of great thoughts. So first, thank you. And you're right, you are one of my, what I called, I suppose, multidisciplinary aliens. Now, aliens don't have to be from another planet. They can be from another land.
Well, I was from another land. I'm from Greece.
That's right. You're from another land and you're from another discipline. Right. So certainly, I want to be clear. There's two things I'm talking about. One thing I was using as a motivation, my work as someone who's promoted and really developed this field of the science of science, to demonstrate precisely the thing that you're talking about, multidisciplinary, between humans, between fields, these expeditions of the things that make large advances. And in fact, I just sent off a paper yesterday to Nature that shows, for example, that this multidisciplinarity, in some sense, is the very character of modern science. It emerges in about 1955 across all sciences, where people are basically, reaching out with their citations, their references. Like, this is the thing that characterizes really the modern scientific method, is not just, that you're experimenting. It's that you use other people's imaginary, from other fields, their empirical patterns, their formal models, their methods, which are unfamiliar to your space, to make advances in your field. That's the thing that really defines modern science. And you see it just pop in the late 1950s and stay current until today. It's the thing that really defines all modern scientific fields. It doesn't matter what field you're exploring. This is all true. And yes, I'm formalizing that, but I'm going to push back on the alien idea. I'm working with two robotic scientist groups. So Ross King has a group in Sweden and Japan, and Andy Cooper has a piece. Let's see if I have it here. It was on the cover of Nature this summer about a robochemist. In those contexts, so he is this robochemist where, these are mobile robots that are wandering around a laboratory. He does give an initial hunch, but they perform completely autonomous experiments on their own, thousands of experiments in the dark. So these are actually photo relevant materials that he's looking for, energy related materials. He has a few hunches and then he seeds them and runs them off. So I'm working with both of these groups to actually take humans out of the loop. I mean, so what are we doing? We're saying, okay, these algorithms can start with a set of seeds that maybe are produced by humans in the past. So humans are in the loop in the sense that we're building on the existence of prior knowledge. But then we're not asking humans what the next experiment is. We're just running a Bayesian optimization that says conditional on the last results of these experiments and all of the findings that are coming up in literature. What's the next optimal experiment? And I think there are two directions to go. One is to race with humans, in which case I would say, yeah, we're optimizing humans in the loop. But the other is to do the opposite, is to basically understand collective intuition as a set of productive but biased intuitions, and to bet against them. And so I'm actually, in the context of this research, but also a number of other projects, doing the same thing, where we're betting against human intuitions. And sometimes these human intuitions are the result of institutionalized conceptions, and sometimes they're the result of simple limits of human capacity. You don't see doctor physicians thinking in like 50-dimensional therapeutic combinatorics for cancer therapies. Human minds can't do it. They can't defend it to others. They're not producing those. They're not testing those, right? So there are certain things that are literally just beyond the human capacity to have intuition about. And there are others that defy existing intuition. So an interesting historical fact is that you see the phenomena that Ben Jones calls the burden of knowledge, which over the 20th century, people who get Nobel Prizes are older and older over the 20th century. When they get their first grant, they're older and older. When they publish their first paper, they're older and older. But those who get their first patent are not older and older, right? They're exactly the same age over the course of the 20th century. So what's going on is there are diminishing marginal returns as we climb up the trees of knowledge. It's just that we haven't climbed all the trees. And so identifying aliens that actually avoid human intuitions and reasoning, that defy and bet against it, is precisely the kinds of opportunities. So you can call that human in the loop. I'm betting against you. I'm using your intuitions to identify something that in some cases is diametrically opposed to those intuitions. So we can call that human in the loop, but it's a very different loop. It's a negative loop. And so I totally agree that, I was motivated to explore this through a study of multi-transdisciplinarity, but that what we're talking about is, I would say that highlights a principle that we can amp up in the context of these alien intelligences, which is to say we can identify and craft aliens which are more different in terms of their kind of cognitive capacity, and more different in terms of the precise training that they've experienced than the space of humans. And they will not be validated. They will seem unintuitive. They will seem alien. They will seem less likely. So when we actually pose experts with our hypotheses, which end up being equally likely scientifically, they seem much less likely to the scientists who we ask. So their intuitions are wrong. They're wrong about these materials because they're not sitting in a place where they have access to the full surround that these alien algorithms have access to. So I completely agree. We're motivated by transdisciplinary scientific engagements, but rather than using those scientific engagements to validate them, we're using them to train against them. We're betting against them.
Yes, let's move on to another question. We have a question from Will Angel. Will?
Yes, good evening, Larry. Good evening, James. James, thank you for the interesting talk. I'm convinced by your argument that many novel discoveries come from expeditions from alien fields of research. But can you tell us more about how you rule out survivorship bias from your research? Could it be the case that novel expeditions from different fields of research are only published when they're interesting, but that there can also be many more expeditions that are not published and do not show up in your data?
Well, yeah, I think that's a great question, and I don't think there's. That's an obvious bias in this data. So even though, yes, right here, like in the earlier work that I mentioned, which is about to come out. This is a pre-publication review of some of these findings. yes, the reasons why the surprising combinations are end up being really surprising is because they're surprising and they work, right? So there's a whole bunch of surprising things that didn't work, right? So the surprising things that people imagine, wouldn't it be amazing? Like no one would have thought, and it turns out, well, the reason no one would have thought is because it's just wrong, and those are being filtered out conveniently, basically by the publication review process. And so that's absolutely the case. If you were just to create, in that case, kind of like alien cross-fertilization, then you would get all kinds of garbage, right? So so is it right for us to presume or to encourage everyone to engage in these kinds of expeditions? Absolutely not. And is there failure, increased rates of failure behind those investigations? Absolutely. And the same is true for these alien intelligences. So even though they end up having actually really quite high theoretical or ground truth, or not ground truth, but theoretical estimates that promote their likelihood, and I'm working with groups that are actually testing their precise likelihood, and it looks good. These predictions look like they're going to be promising. There's no question that to discover more surprising things, you need to undertake more failure. And so, and I think this is a conversation that needs to happen at a national level, is that to receive and achieve more radical advance, punctuated advance, not smooth advance, we need to undertake and achieve much more failure. We have to invest in much more failure in our scientific investigations. It's critical. So absolutely, there is a denominator that's hidden in that particular research project. And I think we should, it needs to be a public education because, they're, consistent critics of major funding agencies who argue, that, look at these, these crazy research programs, these unlikely research or unrelated research programs to questions of practical import. And the answer is those failures are necessary, right? They reflect an underlying set of bets on unlikely, but if true, disruptive findings in this space. So I couldn't agree with you more but I also think that there is strong data to support that where you're willing to turn up your level of failure in this sense, you're also able to increase the likelihood that you produce disruptive findings that destabilize but push forward science to new places that it hadn't previously imagined.
So before we take a question from the web, from John Merrill, I'm going to ask a question. So a lot of what you're saying, we'll leave aside the interdisciplinary aspects, because I think that applies to some things more than others. But I agree with you completely. Interesting things happen in interfaces. But what you're saying about groupthink, in essence, and the fact that people live within a given community have certain preconceptions, or they adhere to a certain group of conceptions, and they look at things a certain way. And so they're more likely to do certain experiments and less likely to do certain other experiments, to the extent that when I was in the lab, we used to have a joke, which was that the most valuable person in the lab was the one who came in with the least knowledge, because they were going to do the crazy experiment that would turn out to be the most insightful, that would produce the most unusual results, that would break preconceived dogma, and that would open up new doors. Of course, it's only partially true. But
because they also probably sometimes broke the experimental apparatus and discovered things that everyone knew were wrong. And yeah, of course.
It turned out that the reason that everybody thought you shouldn't do that experiment, because it didn't turn out very good.
Right.
But it sounds to me like partly what your results seem to show is that we ought to support a heck of a lot more individually motivated, individual investigator, curiosity-driven research, because those people are following their own path. They're not particularly influenced by groupthink. And they're the ones who develop very new tools and very new insights, often working on really obscure things that turned out to be fantastically interesting. Molecular biology, my field, is a case study of people working on something that a lot of people thought was stupid. Who cares about phage? Well, phage turned out to be a really great tool for figuring out how genes work.
Mhm.
And that was individual investigator initiated and driven research. So I wonder if you would comment briefly on whether you think that your research indicates that we really ought to be in the business of supporting a lot more individual investigator driven research and maintaining that infrastructure.
Just to be completely clear, as opposed to what?
As opposed to having to justify your research and how it's going to advance the field as judged by a review committee at NIH.
Yes. Yeah, no.
Or as opposed to being part of a gigantic consortium of people who are going to do something that's obviously useful, like sequence the human genome.
That's right. Yeah, okay. So I think absolutely it supports that. And in fact, one of the things that I show in some of the work on replication, the replication crisis, and Francis Collins had me speak to basically institute directors and others to highlight this fact, is that in these, I would say, laudable movements towards open science, there's also been a consolidation in the creation of singular databases and massively replicated but singular protocol-driven high throughput experiments, which have been used across the community. So they facilitate everybody getting on board and working quickly. But it turns out that this also reduces the likelihood that the findings that come from those experiments will translate to other contexts. And one of those other contexts in the context of medicine is the clinic. Like you don't want something. For example, the very same day that one of my papers was published that showed this diversity, there was a paper by the very consortium that was producing the massive high throughput experiment, and they showed, hey, if we share data and share assumptions, we can improve the replicability across these high throughput experiments. Yes, at the expense of the likelihood that those findings will generalize to other contexts. So the driving out of diversity through these massive consortia has a cost that this highlights, and I think that you're aptly putting your finger on that actually, the cultivation and the identification of independence, and which you formalized in the context of independent scientist-driven activities, is something that needs to be balanced against this large group work. And I had a paper published last year in the spring on the cover of Nature, which showed that as you have larger teams, like larger team size, you have an exponential decline in the likelihood that work will disrupt. And so there are many reasons. One of the reasons is that big teams cost money, and they need to succeed. And so how do you minimize the likelihood that you'll fail? Well, you basically target a finding from last year that was like, a blockbuster, and you do the next step in that research program, and then you're going to get the audience in the same way that Transformers 9 is going to get the audience receipts for Transformers 8 minus epsilon. That's very different logic from small teams. So yes, I have a lot of even different data to support that idea. What I'm proposing here is another step in that regime, which is, even though, the story of cultural evolution, when I say cultural evolution, I mean the development of tools in human societies, the development of shared language, like these massive cultural insights, which are at the base of all human engagement, as well as the collaboration in the context of science, means that, that person that comes in who doesn't know anything and is breaking stuff inside your lab is different from you, but not that different from you. That every person who has come to has received any scientific training, even those who haven't received any scientific training, just watched the news, who've seen cause and effect in the way that it's presented, are closer than we might otherwise think, and that we also need to basically sponsor aliens. When I say aliens, I mean robotic algorithmic intelligences that think differently. So we're basically creating even stupider people to come into the lab. We'll break even more stuff than those stupid, completely uninformed people would have broken before. So that's what I'm arguing for. But yes, I think it's.
We got a question from John Merrill. I'm going to read it out loud here. Is there a tool to examine novelty in scientific publications and patents? And I think you did address that to some extent.
Yeah, we've produced several different kinds of tools, and I welcome you to reach out to me. I have an email that's easily accessible on the web, jevans@uchicago. My lab, Knowledge Lab, produces a number of different tools and databases that scores basically, every major published publication in terms of a number of different kinds of things, in terms of the surprise of the combination of the elements, in terms of the ability or the historical fact that those things have disrupted science by eclipsing the work on which they build, which is to say they come to be perceived as turning points in scientific development, and a number of other approaches. So there are a number of funders in government in the US and China and other places are using these tools now to help identify, prospect, and decide which work to sponsor.
We have a quick question from Catherine Gensler. I think you can answer this one by referring her to your website. She wants to know whether there'll be a list of papers sent out. She'd love to read the papers about material science and COVID that you mentioned. And hopefully they're on your website somewhere. Maybe.
They are, actually.
The references are.
Yeah, the references are, the COVID paper, I just pushed to the archive, which is a preprint server tonight. So it should be publicly available to everybody by tomorrow morning, and I'll be happy to share to.
Which archive? BioArchive or?
The archive.
There's the archive?
Okay. Yeah, no, the physics archive. They invented the archive, yes. So yeah, but yeah, it won't be in the bioarchive, but I suppose I could in parallel push it there. Yeah.
I think if you want to email me the citations, and I'll forward them to.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, but yeah.
Yeah, if you have a chance. We have a question by voice from Carl Merrill. Carl?
Hi, thank you. I enjoyed that lecture. You covered a tremendous amount of material. But one thing that concerns me, and in fact, it was amplified by editorial in Nature yesterday about the need for transparency in AI debaters that are debating against humans, because it turns out that there's an additional element, which you've touched on, and that is in addition to facts and data, there's also the element of emotion. And by building that into the algorithms, one can beat a debater who's using facts. And we see that in our own political system, where a politician can win a debate with almost no facts or very few facts at all by just making things up. So that's a problem. And in fact, I spend my time doing research, and my biggest problem is that people have what I call biases, but that's a polite word for ignorance. And so that pushes them to do experiments in a particular direction. And so it slows everything down, and we may never get the real answer. We'll get lots of data which people can analyze, but it'll be useless. And in fact, you see that in the development of the AI for working on games like Go or chess, where they spent an inordinate amount of time trying to teach the computer the rules that humans used. And then once they developed the programs even further, the computer could run through that in a week or so and develop its own algorithms or methods that beat anything a human could do. So I wonder if you could comment on that and this added dimension of emotion, and how that is probably somewhat destructive and would make it difficult not only for alien computer systems, but in probably dealing with any other visitor who had the intelligence or not intelligence to visit the Earth.
Wow. So cosmic question, but my talk, I'm sure invited it. So I have not actually read I was working on this paper that I'm pushing to the archive today. So I was not reading Nature today. But I think this is an excellent issue. So certainly the algorithms that were and have been developed, for example, were so influential in pushing information and misinformation to people, in some cases, for example, that were associated even with January 6th in Washington, D.C., alone has been widely commented on. And what's interesting is, this description of surprise that I have, this algorithmic surprise ends up being this kind of high likelihood, conditional on it working, of being successful. So if it's successful, it's very successful. It turns out this is precisely what these misinformation campaigns are targeting. So it's more likely for people to follow fake news than true news. And why is it more likely? Well, because the fake news is surprising. The fake news violates their expectations. And if it doesn't violate too many of them, if it's not so outlandish that it's in that optimal space of plausible but fantastic, then it draws their eyeballs. Why? Because people are rational and they're abductors. They're trying to resolve inconsistencies so they follow that knowledge, in some cases trying to test it, in other cases ultimately being duped by it. So I think there are all kinds of massively concerning places in which algorithmic intelligences are being used, are being nefariously deployed, precisely as clickbait and in misinformation campaigns around the world, not only by subversive movements, but by governments. And I can name a number of different cases, and we've been looking at this. A number of different groups have been looking at this. The idea of manipulating human responses to emotional appeals is something they can learn over the billions of user-generated traces of conversation that occur online. So that becomes an exploitable signal, absolutely. And so I think the issue here is that, yes, algorithms can do those things. Yes, algorithms are doing those things. People will continue to make algorithms that do those things. There will be others that try to make algorithms that can detect those kinds of tendencies and limit those kinds of tendencies, or have platforms that identify and take down things that have particular kinds of intent. But I think it's a major issue and a major problem in society. At the same time, I think it underlies, and so what do we do with this? I think is in some ways another question, because there's a deep need to understand and think about how to regulate these intelligences that are kind of spurring up everywhere. What I'm proposing here is the need to deploy that same potentially nefarious technology for scientifically advancing and righteous ends, right? So, and I believe that basically any powerful technology, in this case, an artificial intelligence that identifies deep regularities over massive patterns of data, generalizing to future contexts, can necessarily be used as an evil weapon and as a righteous tool to accomplish a righteous purposes. It depends on our underlying values. And so I think one of the things that I've been actively promoting, and I think is critical in this space, is a deeper understanding of what our values actually are, right? We need to be more explicit about what those values are if we're going to program them into our algorithms, or if we're going to police our algorithms that develop alternative but complementary values, that they are complementary and not competing or substitutive. So I think, again, the increased power of these algorithms increases the need for us to formalize values that previously were hidden or implicit. For example, if you are wondering, how can we better fund science from the NIH? It's the biggest civilian funding organization of science or technology in the world. How do we better do that? And the first question you need to ask is, what does it actually do? What are the underlying values that are reflected in all the choices it makes across all of the allocations that it's made since, for example, 1971, which is the instantiation of the R1, individual researcher mechanism. We need to understand the values that we have expressed in the past and expose them, right? Some of those things that we see that it's valued or not valued are not things that we would agree upon today. So we need to expose them for public debate so we can come to agreement about what it is that we agree upon, so that we can build in an awareness of those things, not necessarily just a prohibition against, but awareness of those things into our algorithms. But I think the questions you raise are major questions. One final point that I neglected was, you mentioned this idea of transparency, the importance of transparency. And I think it is absolutely true that we need to audit our algorithms in the same way that we audit our human institutions. And let me be clear, I think we do a really bad job at auditing our human institutions. Like, if we were to have an algorithm that is the judge, that decides whether someone goes to jail, whether or not someone gets bail, do we evaluate those algorithms, those human algorithms, those judges? No, we don't. We don't do that. People are starting to do it, and they're doing it today because they've developed algorithms that are based on humans, and people identify the algorithms as biased, and they go back and they see the humans on which they're based as being fundamentally biased. So I would say this moment that we're in is an exciting moment, because the algorithms, by asking about the values that are underlying their work, we're exposing our own values and exposing them for critique. I would finally say, to that point about transparency, that you can't, well, we can, but it would be very unwise for us to demand too much transparency of our algorithms. And the reason is the same reason we don't demand too much transparency of our judges, right? If you were to ask our judge, why did you make that determination? And they tell you a story that they produce in answer to your question, but they can't articulate how you were feeling at the moment that you made that ultimate judgment, because it's such a fundamentally complex system, which enables them to be flexible and self-normalizing and adjusting. And the same will be true of our algorithms. So if we expect them to be completely transparent and trivial, then they will only be able to perform trivial work for us. So
we have a related question here. Maybe you've kind of answered it, from Michael Nelson, I think. Yeah, Michael Nelson. Can you unmute and ask your question?
Thank you very much. Really a fascinating talk and very fact-filled. I live inside the Beltway, and I've been working on digital policy, digital technology policy for more than 30 years. So I know how important picking the right words are. So let me start with a suggestion, which is you stop using the word alien, which is one of the most explosive political words in Washington, and shy away from saying artificial intelligence when you really mean something totally different. And so that brings me to my question. If we call it alt intelligence or alternative to intelligence, whatever we call it, this interesting new paradigm, is it going to be regulated? We have a lot of politicians eager to regulate AI because it's new and different and subject to some abuse. Are there problems you see here that could cause politicians to reach for the pen and try to write some rules? And on the other side, is there something they should be doing to make this easier and something that spreads more quickly to get humans and people and data working together more seamlessly?
I think those are great points. Thank you for your rebranding approach. I wanted to provoke a conversation, a lively conversation, and I succeeded with your and others' questions here today. But yeah, I appreciate any branding suggestions you have on the journey of this paradigm. I think I think there's no question that these are things that will require collective intervention and regulation. I think it's going to require a lot more intelligence insight than we have right now, and it's going to require something else that I think we really need to regulate it right. So, for example, even in the space of academic sciences, people are very interested in the way in which algorithms reduce transparency, create black box decisions, that are inscrutable and kind of unidentifiable, and also that that expose privacy of individual persons' data, because all these AIs are just driven. They're data hungry. They need data from the world, either data that you generate in the context of reinforcement learning or data that's available passively as produced by something like science or interaction on the web or whatever. And so there's a lively industry which identifies harms to privacy and harms to individuals from exposing their data, which is the thing on which really all of these AIs are driven. And so, but on the flip side, we actually don't have much of science of the combinatorial value of combining these things into algorithms. We don't have a science, that's really exploring the ways of combining novel types of data through these alternative intelligences to generate value. And so people in the academy are systematically surprised at how stupid people are at releasing all their data into the wild when they're not acknowledging the fact that people have a calculus, that they're acknowledging the potential upsides to sharing their data, which is all these intelligence services, which spam them with less irrelevant ads than they were spammed on, by TV and other things. So I think two things. One, I think absolutely we're going to have some competition policy that relates to AI and data. Ultimately, that allows us and sanctions the combining of some things and the inability to combine other things. Because that combination of all possible types of data facilitates and really drives different kinds of discrimination, and will drive those kinds of discriminations in the context of insurance premiums. It's irresistible, and it's impossible to imagine. In AI, one other thing that we often do is we'll get an objective which is a proxy of the actual thing that we want. And the relationship between that proxy and our actual objective encodes a bias, which can be deeply problematic. So my colleague Sendil Mullainathan here at the University of Chicago showed recently, for example, that the most prevalent algorithmic decision maker for giving people health benefits in the United States basically treats Black persons as at the same level of access to benefits as healthy as white persons that are 5 times as sick. And the reason is because they're using as a proxy for healthiness the likelihood that insurance payments have been placed on those persons for those kinds of diseases in the past, and because Black persons have historically been less likely to go to physicians and been more suspect for good reason of those physician services, that proxy means that they get far fewer services than they would otherwise get. And so all this to say is I absolutely think that we need to develop new capacity in government for surveilling these algorithms in the same way that we need to surveil and regulate other decision-making bodies. Because these algorithms are becoming our primary decision-making bodies. And I would say there's actually hope, because it's much easier to identify and engineer out a bias from an AI algorithm, to lay it as a constraint, than it is to take a bias out of the judicial system, or to take a bias out of like the complex system of like tens of thousands of physicians and insurance providers, right? So this actually provides us with, I think, a burden to create the capacity to evaluate these decisions, but at the same time, I think an opportunity, because it's much easier to remediate bias from an algorithmic system than it is from a complex human system.
I'm gonna take
Thank you very much.
one or two more questions. We have one from a PSW member, Tim Thomas, which I'm going to read, I think. Tim says, seems like you're describing an elaborate voting system in which different algorithms, sources of data, and human groups all give weighted opinions to a particular problem, like which chess piece to move. Have you explicitly been able to determine how many voters you should allow? Is more always better?
Okay, so I would say, thank you for calling this elaborate, and I'm sorry for your having to call it elaborate. We're trying to make it simple, but you're right. There are moving parts. On the other hand, there was a little bit of an oxymoron there in your question, a very interesting question, elaborate and voting, right? Because voting is not a very complex system, as you suggest. I mean, the answer to your question is embedded in the question. So if there are people that are informed about good, have a good policy in mind, a policy which will eventually produce the most happiness if you're a utilitarian, or facilitate the most virtue if you're an Aristotelian, whatever your ethical stance, then it may not be an equal weight of all of the voters, right? It may be that certain enlightened voters should have a greater voice than unenlightened voters. And that's no longer a voting system. That's a deliberative system where you have different actors that are engaged in performances to persuade others that their opinions are better than those others. That is a sophisticated system. And I am completely arguing for that. I'm completely arguing for a complex deliberative system in which algorithmic agents and the agents in human innovative societies propose and provoke each other with insights and patterns and possibilities that they could not have achieved on their own. That is, and so it's really what we're selling. You're right. It's not a package. It's an environment. It's an ecosystem. How can we? I completely stand behind the idea that building artificial intelligence, which just has a bullseye on human capacity, is not the way to magnify human capacity or human benefit. It is to target the ultimate benefits that we seek, and then growing the diversity that we require. So to your point, is it just like, does any diversity matter, and is more always better? And the answer is no. It really has to do with designing the right diversity, designing diversity that compensates for our limitations and biases in sensing, in reasoning, and in coming to agreement. And so part of our program, and part of the program that I'm pushing, is that this requires not less understanding of human and collective capacity, but it requires much more, right? Because those limits are the things that we need to design these aliens or alternatives past or beyond.
So I'll take just a couple more from the web here. We have a question from Yang Cho. He asks, I apologize, probably pronounced that wrong. How do you propose we maximally diversify human intelligence when virtually all PhDs are trained under fixed curricula and are expected to produce papers in only certain fields?
That is a problem. That's a challenge. One of the points that I highlight in this paper is that we need to think about education differently. And this is related and bound up with this idea of our willingness to undertake failures, like the theoretical venture capitalist. The theoretical venture capitalist is one who places 20 bets and expects one to succeed and the others to fail, and that achieves a sufficient rate of return. I say theoretical, not actual venture capitalists, because if you look across all venture capitalists, they actually copy each other slavishly to reduce that betting. So while an individual venture capitalist might be hedging their bets, the entire system of venture capital is not hedged. But this means, in terms of education, that we need to think about it fundamentally differently. We need to think about education for discovery, such that every student becomes an experiment. Every student becomes an experiment of their unique combination of background experiences, methods, etc. And what does that mean? That means at the end of education, we'll have a distribution of, we're going to have, to Larry's point, we're going to have much more unusual alien people who are unfamiliar with some parts of the lab, but bring to those labs things that have never shown their face in labs like that before. And that's going to yield more failures, but the successes that it achieves are going to be more disruptive. I mean, I think there's no question. I mean, I've looked at this across 100 million papers now, and every patent that's been granted around the globe and any mature legal system. And these are, So I think to your point, cultivating diversity requires a fundamentally new way of thinking about education. Right now, education is a control system, so a department, a discipline. We are disciplined, we've committed to, what have we committed to? We've committed that there are a set of questions which will be profitably answered by a set of methods. That we have a set of concerns, and the discipline is that we agree that there are a set of approaches that will get us to the resolution of those concerns. And, and we basically, admonish the old to train the young. And I have some slides of paper that I'm just finishing right now, which shows, and, I'm getting older myself, I'm 51, but it shows that if you look at the aging of scientists from their first publication, their citations age linearly, like throughout the rest of the life course. The new topics, or the topics at the frontier that they incorporate in the research, drops linearly over that time. And here's the education point. And this is the most deep. Here's the problem with that. When scientists hit about year 10, which means tenure, basically, at universities, what's different about them and younger scientists is not just the aging of their ideas, but that when they cite younger ideas, they cite them in contrast to their own ideas. So they're disciplined and discourage, criticize those younger ideas. And it turns out scientists with demographically older collections of population are much more likely to do this. And so you see much smaller churns of ideas, much less progress, and young scientists fleeing and refusing to enter those, or less likely at a lower rate entering those fields than we would see previously. So these are the results of institutionalized education systems. And I think we need to study them more. I just worked with some colleagues at Columbia to help cultivate and curate a collection of about 10 million syllabi to identify precisely this process, which is to say how it is the cost of the institutionalization of education. And so I think we need to identify unequivocally the cost before people are going to recognize. It's harder to run education that's not run by the old. I mean, it's like when it's not a control set, like the paradigm for building that has to sit across disciplines. That's going to require a new social contract within and across universities. So it's a really hard problem, but I think it's one that needs to be attacked.
Last question. Giovanni Aurelio asks, are intelligent machines at this point capable of reproducing and improving themselves?
So,
As yet.
yeah, I mean, so I don't know. I think you had Hod Libson come and present a presentation some time ago.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, I know Hod well, and so he certainly has been interested in exploring reproducing robots, and he comes from the evolutionary algorithms tradition in that space and merging it with other traditions. But I think there's no question that even routine algorithms are learning from their failures. And so what are the classes of, so in supervised learning, any class of boosting algorithms are just, the algorithm is designed to learn from its failures. How does it do it? It, literally just stacks a supervised learner to solve a problem. It calculates the error. It upweights the value for the next algorithm that you're going to train on solving the problems that the last algorithm couldn't solve. And the next one on top of that, the next one on top of that. So that's been around for 15 years, I would say, and really is the dominant approach in the context of like fields where you have to handcraft variables. But I would say, we're much more advanced. The thing that's been radical advance in AI over the course of the last decade has been the rise of reinforcement learning. And reinforcement learning is a paradigm where you're developing an agent that explicitly learns from its failures in dynamic online data. And that's where you've seen, the Go champion machines and, protein folding machines that, dramatically outpace, human and related, short form algorithmic efforts to do those same problems. And I think, that's, and so what I'm encouraging is even within those algorithmic reinforcement learners, we need to take into account the distribution of human and organizational algorithmic agents, prediction engines, which are running around if we want to optimize and maximize the benefits that we all can achieve together, how far we can see and achieve together. So we are at a place where we're definitely creating algorithms that learn from themselves. What we're not at the place of doing, and what I hope to provoke with this talk in you, is the potential for algorithms and humans collectively to learn from each other's successes and mistakes in an ongoing partnership, in an online partnership. So.
And with that happy and optimistic outlook, which we hope will come true, which I actually think is already happening.
Well, we have to chase this, even if the other one is on our heels. We have to chase these benefits. Certainly, the nefarious things will come to pass, and we need machines to battle them. To be real.
I think so. With that, I want to thank you for giving this very, and I think provocative, really thought-provoking in that sense, provocative lecture that I think people are going to be talking about this quite a bit. And this is a great start to what I want to be a series of lectures on AI, which I prefer to probably call machine implemented intelligences, but that's too big of a mouthful, in the coming lecture series. So let me thank you for joining us and bid you good night.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and the conversation.
Perhaps we'll see you afterwards.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll drop into the room.
Yeah. And thank everyone else for joining us. The recording of tonight's lecture will be available to everyone on the PSW Science YouTube channel and in due course on Vimeo and via the PSW Science website. Please share the links with your friends and subscribe to the channel for notifications on news postings. Please do not hesitate to join PSW. We love to have new members, and we invite you to go to our website and join using the join button, believe it or not. Before you go, a few closing announcements. The next meeting, number 2439, will be on April 23rd. As I mentioned before, the speakers will be Simon Bennett and Dan Irwin of the London Crossrail Project. They will be speaking on the construction of the new Elizabeth Line subway, cutting underneath London, sometimes within a stone's throw, a few inches of London's loftiest skyscrapers. The 2440th meeting will be on May 7th. The speaker will be Tony Tyson, Distinguished Professor of Astronomy at UC Davis and Chief Scientist at the Reuben Observatory, formerly the LSST. He will be speaking about the potential impacts of satellite constellations like SpaceX's Starlink constellation on astronomical observatories like the LSST and on ways to mitigate these effects. 2441st meeting will be on May 21st. The speaker will be Bill Powell of the State University of New York, College of Environmental Sciences and Forestry. He will be speaking about the chestnut blight and approaches to bringing back a blight-resistant American chestnut tree, a tree that at one time dominated the northeastern forests and now is entirely gone. The 2442nd meeting will be on June 4th and will feature the annual Joseph Henry Lecture. The speaker will be Carlo Ravelli, director of the Quantum Gravity Group at the Center for Theoretical Physics in Marseille, France, and also visiting research head at the Perimeter Institute in Canada. He will be speaking on quantum gravity. For those of you who haven't read his books, I highly recommend them to you. They're not only a wonderful layperson's introduction, some of these concepts in quantum gravity, but they're quite lyrical. The 2443rd meeting will be on June 18th to round out and cap the spring lecture series. The speaker will be Steve Stitch, program manager of NASA's Commercial Crew Program. He will be speaking on the Commercial Crew Program and U.S. manned spaceflight. Changes to the spring lecture series, should there be any, and lectures coming this fall will be posted to the PSW website. Check there often for updates. And with that, one last thing before we go. Let's please thank tonight's crew, James, Ann, Robin, and Cameo for producing tonight's event. Thank you all very much. And a little bit of a salute to PSW on its 150th year, which we'll be celebrating throughout this year until March 12th of next year, 2022. Keep posted for announcements of these upcoming celebrations. And I will now adjourn the 2438th meeting of the Society. I wish everyone a good evening. The lecture is adjourned.